June 6, 1944, 05:10 hours. Widerstands Nest 62, overlooking the Baie de Seine. The air is cold. It carries the damp, salty tang of the English Channel and the smell of wet soil. Inside the cramped, stale confines of the Regelbau 1667 casemate, Obergefreiter Heinrich Severloh of the German 352nd Infantry Division shivers, though not entirely from the pre-dawn chill. He wraps his hands around a tin mug of bitter, lukewarm ersatz coffee, its warmth doing little to penetrate the deep-seated tension that has lived in his bones for weeks. For months, they had waited. The constant drone of Allied reconnaissance planes, the vague reports from high command, the endless work of strengthening their position, it had all blended into a monotonous, grim routine. This concrete and steel beast, designated Strong Point 62, was his world. Its thick walls had become a second skin, its firing aperture a permanent lens through which he viewed the gray, churning sea. From here, with his MG-42 machine gun, he commanded a sweeping arc of a shoreline the Allies had codenamed Omaha Beach. He'd fought on the Eastern Front. He had seen things that had scoured the youth from his eyes, horrors that visited him in the slivers of sleep he managed in the damp shared bunks. But that was a war of movement, of mud and snow and vast empty plains. This was different. Here, he felt like a keeper of a great gate, a sentinel perched on the edge of the world, waiting for an enemy he could not see. He believed in the wall. Every man did. Field Marshal Rommel himself had inspected these defenses. They were told that the Atlantic Wall was a fortress, Europe's shield against the inevitable storm. The interlocking fields of fire, the millions of mines seeded in the sand and submerged in the surf, the pre-sighted artillery. It was a symphony of destruction, waiting for its conductor. A flicker of movement outside catches his eye. A junior NCO, his face barely visible in the gloom, is making his rounds. They exchange a tired nod. The night has been quiet, deceptively so. The weather reports had promised storms, gales that would make any sea crossing suicidal. The tension of the previous days had eased, replaced by a sullen boredom, yet something felt wrong. The air itself seemed to hum with a strange energy. Heinrich pulls a creased photograph from his breast pocket. The smiling face of his wife, Annalisa, and his young son, their images faded from his constant touch. He had written to them just last week, a letter full of forced confidence. The position is impregnable, he'd written. Let them come. They will break themselves upon our rock. He had almost believed it himself. He turns his gaze back to the firing slit, staring out into the dark expanse. The sea and the sky are one, a seamless canvas of charcoal gray. But then he hears it. Not a sound at first, but a vibration, a low, deep thrumming that seems to come from everywhere at once, a resonance that travels through the concrete floor and up into his teeth. It is deeper than thunder, more persistent than an engine. It is the sound of a world changing, and as the first hint of dawn begins to bleed across the horizon, he sees it. At first, he thinks his eyes are playing tricks on him, that the shadows on the water are phantoms born of fatigue. But the shadows take form. They resolve into shapes. Hundreds of them, then thousands. The horizon is no longer a line. It is a dense, jagged forest of steel masts and hulking silhouettes, stretching from one end of the sea to the other. It is not an armada. It is a nation afloat, a floating city of war, appearing from the mists of the channel like a vengeful specter. The coffee mug slips from his numb fingers, clattering onto the concrete floor, the sound lost in the growing, terrible rumble from the sea. The rock he had placed his faith in was about to be hit by a tidal wave. And in that moment, staring at the impossible sight of 5,000 ships, Heinrich Severloh understood that everything he had been told was a lie. The structure that Heinrich Severloh and nearly 60,000 other German soldiers called home on the Normandy coast was the Atlantic Wall. It was one of the most ambitious and formidable defensive undertakings in modern military history, yet it was also a masterpiece of propaganda, a carefully constructed illusion of invincibility that concealed critical, and ultimately fatal, flaws. Conceived in 1942 under the auspices of Fritz Todt, and later massively expanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel in late 1943, the wall was a testament to German engineering and forced labor. Stretching over 3,000 miles from the Norwegian fjords to the Spanish border, its purpose was singular: to make Fortress Europe impregnable from the west. The plan called for a continuous chain of 15,000 concrete fortifications, manned by 300,000 troops, all designed to defeat an amphibious invasion force at the water's edge. The Normandy sector, under the command of the German 7th Army, was a microcosm of the wall's strengths and weaknesses. Field Marshal Rommel, having witnessed the overwhelming power of Allied air supremacy in North Africa, was a fanatic proponent of defeating the invasion on the beaches. "The war will be won or lost on the beaches," he famously declared. "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. For the Allies, as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day." Under his energetic command, the defenses in Normandy had been dramatically improved. He ordered the installation of millions of mines, both anti-tank and anti-personnel, sown in the sands and coastal fields. He devised a devilish array of beach obstacles. There were Czech hedgehogs, massive welded steel jacks designed to rip open the hulls of landing craft. There were Belgian gates, heavy steel frames rigged with mines. Most infamous were the Rommelspargel, or Rommel's asparagus, angled wooden poles driven into the sand below the high tide line, many topped with a teller mine, designed to impale and destroy landing craft as the tide came in. The core of the defense rested on the Widerstandsnester, or resistance nests. These were clusters of concrete bunkers, casemates, and trenches, strategically positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire. A typical strongpoint, like Severlow's WN-62 on Omaha Beach, was a self-contained fortress. It featured casemates for anti-tank guns, often a 75mm or 88mm cannon, machine gun Tobruks providing 360-degree fields of fire for the devastating MG-42, and reinforced shelters for infantry squads. These nests were connected by a labyrinth of trenches and protected by barbed wire and minefields. The firepower was scientifically planned. Machine gunners were given specific overlapping sectors of fire. Mortar teams had pre-calculated firing solutions for every square meter of the beach. Artillery batteries, positioned several kilometers inland and heavily camouflaged, were zeroed in on the shoreline, ready to unleash a storm of high explosives on command. On paper, it was a perfect killing machine, designed to turn the beaches of Normandy into a meat grinder. Omaha Beach was particularly well defended. A crescent-shaped stretch of sand 4 miles long, it was overlooked by steep bluffs rising up to 150 feet. Any attacker would have to cross a wide, open expanse of beach, completely exposed to fire from the defenders dug into these heights. 15 of these resistance nests, from WN-60 in the west to WN-74 in the east, controlled every inch of the sand. The troops manning these defenses were a mixed bag. The 716th Infantry Division was a static formation, composed of older men and conscripts from occupied territories, primarily Poland and Russia. They were considered low-grade troops, suitable for garrison duty. However, in a stroke of incredible misfortune for the Allies, Rommel had recently insisted on moving a far more potent formation into the coastal area. The 352nd Infantry Division, a full-strength unit with a corps of hardened veterans from the Eastern Front, had been repositioned just inland from Omaha and Utah beaches. They were well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. It was elements of this division, including Heinrich Severlow, who manned the key positions overlooking Omaha. Yet for all its concrete steel and tactical ingenuity, the Atlantic Wall was a brittle shield. It was a linear defense, powerful at the point of contact but lacking depth. If the Allies could breach it, there was very little in the way of a strategic reserve to push them back. The infamous Panzer divisions, the key to defeating any successful landing, were held back under the direct control of Hitler's High Command, OKW, their deployment mired in a confused and indecisive command structure. Rommel wanted them close to the coast. His superior, Gerd von Rundstedt, wanted them further back for a decisive counterattack. In the end, they were positioned too far to do either effectively. The wall was also incomplete. By June 1944, only a fraction of the planned 15,000 fortifications were finished. Resources were stretched thin between construction, the war in Italy, and the titanic struggle on the Eastern Front. Ultimately, the Atlantic Wall was an illusion, a powerful one but an illusion nonetheless. It was a crust, not a core. It was designed to deter, to intimidate, and to inflict horrific casualties on the first wave. But it was built on the fatal assumption that the enemy would not be able to bring overwhelming, concentrated and sustained force to bear at a single point. It was an assumption that was about to be obliterated by the sight on the horizon. While the German sentries peered into the dark, the largest amphibious force in human history was completing its perilous journey across the English Channel. Codenamed Operation Neptune, The naval component of the Overlord invasion plan was an undertaking of breathtaking scale and complexity. It was the culmination of years of planning, industrial production, and strategic deception. The fleet had assembled from ports all across southern England. On the night of June 5th, it converged on a designated rendezvous point south of the Isle of Wight, a 20-square-mile patch of sea nicknamed Piccadilly Circus. From there, 10 channels were swept through German minefields, leading the armada towards the shores of Normandy. The numbers were staggering. The force comprised nearly 7,000 vessels of every conceivable type. At its heart were the warships of the bombardment groups, 7 battleships, including the American veterans USS Texas and USS Arkansas, and the British HMS Warspite and Ramillies, over 20 cruisers, 250 destroyers and escort vessels. This was the Steel Fist, tasked with pulverizing the Atlantic Wall before the first soldier set foot on the sand. Following them was the vast, sprawling array of transport and landing ships. There were over 4,000 landing craft, the iconic Higgins Boats, LCVP, the British LCAs, the larger LCTs, landing craft tank, and LCIs, landing craft infantry. These were the fragile vessels that would carry the hopes of the free world on the final, terrifying dash to the shore. Aboard these craft, 156,000 men waited. They were American, British, Canadian, Polish, Free French, Norwegian, and more. They were a cross-section of their societies: farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Manchester, fishermen from Nova Scotia. For most, this would be their first taste of combat. Let us focus on one: Private First Class Jack Riley, 19 years old, from Bedford, Virginia, a member of Company A, 116th Infantry Regiment, attached to the 29th Division. He is huddled inside the cramped, suffocating hull of a British crude LCA. The craft pitches and rolls violently in the choppy seas, a consequence of the very weather that had lulled the German command into a false sense of security. The air is thick with the stench of diesel fumes, damp wool, and vomit. Around him, dozens of other young men are packed shoulder to shoulder, each lost in his own world of fear and anticipation. For hours, Jack has been seasick, retching into a cardboard bucket until there is nothing left. His M1 Garand rifle, cleaned and oiled for the 10th time, feels slick with condensation in his hands. He can hear the constant slap of waves against the thin plywood hull, a sound that seems to be counting down the final minutes of his life. He clutches an amulet in his pocket, a St. Christopher medal his mother gave him. He tries to recall the Lord's Prayer, but the words jumble in his mind, crowded out by the gnawing anxiety. The sergeants move among them, their voices low and steady, offering words of encouragement that sound hollow against the roar of the engines. They are told the plan is perfect. Thousands of heavy bombers will have already turned the German defenses into a moonscape. The battleships will then level anything that remains. They are assured that they will likely walk onto the beach with minimal resistance. "Just get across the sand and to the shingle," the lieutenant had said. "The Air Corps and the Navy will have done the rest." Jack wants to believe it. He looks at the faces around him, illuminated by the dim red glow of a single battle lantern. He sees boys his own age trying to project an image of steely resolve, their jaws tight, their knuckles white as they grip their weapons. He sees others with their eyes closed, their lips moving in silent prayer. No one speaks of home, of loved ones. To do so would be to invite a weakness they cannot afford. Through the night, they had watched the vast, dark shapes of the warships slide past them, ghost-like and immense. They had seen the sky crisscrossed with the navigation lights of thousands of aircraft, the drone of their engines a constant, reassuring hum. It felt like they were part of something immense, something unstoppable. But now, as the LCA circles endlessly in the marshalling area, waiting for the signal to head for the shore, the sheer scale of the operation becomes a source of personal terror. He is just one man among 156,000, a single grain of sand in a great tidal wave. His life feels infinitesimally small, his survival a matter of pure, terrifying chance. The ramp at the front of the boat, a simple sheet of steel, seems like the door to another world, a gateway between the life he has known and an unknown, violent fate. The sound of the naval guns has not yet begun. There is only the heaving of the sea and the anxious breathing of 30 men in a small wooden box, about to be delivered into hell for the German High Command. The early hours of June 6th were a period of deep confusion, compounded by a catastrophic lack of urgency. The entire defensive strategy for the West was predicated on correctly identifying the main Allied invasion point. Through Operation Fortitude, a brilliant and complex Allied deception campaign, The Germans had been thoroughly convinced that the primary assault would fall on the Pas de Calais, the shortest sea crossing from England to France. Dummy armies, fake radio traffic, and double agents had painted a vivid and utterly false picture of a massive buildup opposite Calais. Normandy was considered a secondary diversionary target at best. The weather was their greatest ally in this delusion. The German Meteorological Office had forecast continued storms and high seas for the first week of June, making a large-scale amphibious landing a practical impossibility. This forecast was so definitive that several senior commanders were absent from their posts. Field Marshal Rommel, convinced no invasion could happen, had left France to travel back to Germany to celebrate his wife's 50th birthday, planning to meet with Hitler the next day to plead for direct command of the Panzer Reserves. General Friedrich Dahlmann, commander of the 7th Army in Normandy, was at a war games exercise in Rennes. The first reports to filter into German command posts were of Allied paratroopers landing inland. At around 0130, Major Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division received reports of parachutes and gliders. But when these scattered reports reached the higher echelons, they were dismissed. The prevailing belief was that this was a diversion, a feint designed to draw attention away from the real invasion at Calais. The fog of war, deliberately thickened by the Allies dropping thousands of dummy paratroopers, Ruperts, that exploded on landing, created a picture of chaos, not of a coordinated assault. At Hitler's headquarters in Berchtesgaden, the Führer was asleep. His aides, including Generals Jodl and Keitel, received the reports from Normandy but refused to wake him. They were terrified of his infamous rages and, more importantly, they lacked the authority to release the critical panzer reserves without his direct order. The most powerful military force in Normandy, the panzer divisions that Rommel knew were essential to defeating a landing, remained idle, waiting for a sleeping dictator hundreds of miles away to give the word. The German command and control system, rigid and centralized, was paralyzed at the most crucial moment in the war. Back on the coast, at Strongpoint WN62, the reality was dawning not in a series of confusing teletype reports, but in a moment of pure, undiluted shock. The low, persistent rumble that Heinrich Severloh had felt through the concrete had grown into a palpable roar. It was the sound of thousands of diesel engines, the churning of countless propellers. A lookout perched in a forward observation post was the first to see it clearly. Through his powerful Zeiss binoculars, he scanned the horizon as the gloom of night reluctantly gave way to the pale, watery light of dawn. He had expected to see nothing but gray waves. Instead, he saw the impossible. His panicked voice crackled over the field telephone connected to the main bunker. "Ships! I see ships!" The officer in charge grabbed the receiver. "How many?" There was a pause. The lookout seemed to be struggling for words. I can't count them." "It's not ships. It's all of them. The entire sea is full of ships." Severloh and the others in the casemate scrambled to their observation slits. What they saw defied comprehension. The foggy horizon of 5 minutes ago had transformed into a solid wall of dark gray metal. It was a city of warships that had materialized out of the morning mist, stretching as far as the eye could see in either direction. The scale was inhuman, psychologically overwhelming. There were the hulking, menacing silhouettes of battleships and cruisers, their huge gun turrets already turning to face the shore. Swarming around them like pilot fish were the smaller, faster shapes of destroyers, and beyond them an endless, uncountable swarm of smaller vessels, the landing craft, circling like angry wasps. For men who had been told they were guarding a fortress against a coming raid, this was a revelation of apocalyptic proportions. This was not a raid. This was not a diversion. This was annihilation arriving by sea. The confidence that had been built on months of preparation, on the strength of their concrete and steel, evaporated in a single instant. The meticulously planned fields of fire, the carefully laid minefields, it all seemed suddenly, pathetically insignificant in the face of such overwhelming power. Disbelief turned to awe, and awe curdled into a cold, sickening dread. They were not defenders of a fortress. They were bait in a trap, and the trap was about to be sprung. The psychological foundation of the Atlantic Wall had been shattered before the first shell was even fired. At 0550 hours, the order was given. Aboard the flagship USS Augusta, Rear Admiral Alan Kirk gave the command to commence bombardment of the coast. And with that, the world erupted in fire and thunder. The opening salvo came from the deep guttural roar of the heavy naval guns. From over 10,000 yards out, the 14-inch guns of the USS Texas and the 12-inch guns of the USS Arkansas spoke first. Each shell weighed as much as a small car, traveling faster than the speed of sound, and arced high into the morning sky before descending upon the coast with the force of a meteor. The sound was not a single bang, but a cascading series of reports, a deafening, rolling thunder that echoed across the water and shook the very air. For the men in the landing craft, like Private Jack Riley, it was a terrifying and awe-inspiring spectacle. They watched as the great ships behind them were wreathed in smoke and flame, unleashing a torrent of destruction upon the land they were about to assault. The sky above them filled with the dark specks of the shells, a steel rainstorm flying towards the shore. They saw the bluffs of Omaha Beach erupt in fountains of dirt, smoke, and debris. It was impossible to believe anything could survive such a cataclysm. Closer in, the cruisers and destroyers joined the chorus. The British cruisers HMS Glasgow and HMS Bellona, and the American USS Tuscaloosa, pounded their designated targets with rapid-fire 6-inch and 8-inch guns. Destroyers like the USS Satterley and Thompson steamed daringly close to the shore, their 5-inch guns firing directly at the visible German emplacements, their shells screaming like banshees. The bombardment was a carefully choreographed ballet of destruction, with naval gunfire controllers and spotter planes overhead directing the fall of shot, calling out corrections to the gunnery officers miles out at sea. But the most visually spectacular, and perhaps most terrifying, weapon was unleashed by the flotilla of landing craft, tank, rocket. These were standard LCTs that had been converted into floating rocket batteries. Each one carried over 1,000 5-inch rockets. In a single deafening volley that lasted mere seconds, these craft could saturate a 1,000-yard stretch of beach with high explosives. The sight was apocalyptic, a sheet of flame erupting from the LCT, followed by a sky filled with smoke trails as the rocket streaked towards the beach, exploding in a ripple of fire and shrapnel that tore the sand and the German obstacles to shreds. For Heinrich Severloh and the men inside WN-62, the world ceased to exist. It was replaced by a sensory Armageddon. The first battleship shell struck the cliff face several hundred yards away, and the concussion wave that slammed into their concrete bunker felt like the fist of God. The structure, which had felt so permanent and solid, groaned and shuddered. The air was instantly filled with a thick fog of concrete dust and cordite fumes. Light bulbs shattered. Equipment was thrown from shelves. Then the shells began to land all around them. The sound was no longer a series of explosions. It was a single, continuous, earth-shattering roar that defied description. It was a physical presence, a crushing weight that hammered on the bunker, on their bodies, on their minds. Severloh was thrown from his feet, his head smashing against the steel mount of his MG-42. His ears rang with a piercing shriek, and a trickle of blood ran from his nose. He tried to shout to the man next to him, but no sound came out. The noise consumed everything. Through the firing slit, he could see nothing but a maelstrom of smoke, fire, and geysers of earth being thrown hundreds of feet into the air. The meticulously planned fields of fire were now a meaningless concept. His machine gun, the feared Hitler's buzzsaw, was silent, its crew cowering on the floor, their hands clamped over their ears, their faces pale with shock. The bunker, designed to be a fortress, had become a coffin, a concrete drum being beaten by 1,000 giant hammers. The psychological impact was as devastating as any physical damage. It was an assault not just on their bodies and their defenses, but on their sanity. The message being delivered by the Allied fleet was clear and brutal. There is nowhere to hide. Resistance is futile. The sheer overwhelming violence of the bombardment was designed to induce a state of shock and paralysis, to shatter the defenders' will to fight before they even saw the face of an enemy soldier. The Allied plan was built on a simple, brutal logic: the preliminary bombardment, combining the crushing power of the air forces and the Navy, would systematically dismantle the Atlantic Wall. The heavy bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force were tasked with cratering the beaches and destroying the main defensive fortifications. The naval guns were to finish the job, suppressing any remaining pockets of resistance and clearing paths through the beach obstacles. By the time the first wave of infantry landed, the German defenses were expected to be a shattered, smoking ruin. But on Omaha Beach, the plan went catastrophically wrong. The devastating steel typhoon, so terrifying to witness and endure, proved to be shockingly ineffective against its primary targets. The unexpected outcome was not a shattered wall, but a wall that had been deafened, shaken, and terrorized, but left physically, lethally, intact. The failure began in the air. Over 480 B-24 Liberator bombers were assigned to attack the Omaha Beach defenses. They were scheduled to drop over 1,200 tons of bombs in the 30 minutes preceding the landing. However, Due to the heavy, low-lying cloud cover, the lead bombardiers were faced with a terrible choice: risk dropping their payloads short and hitting their own incoming fleet, or delay the release by a few seconds to ensure the ships were safe. Universally, they chose the latter. That decision, lasting only a few seconds, meant that the entire payload of bombs fell harmlessly inland, missing the beach defenses completely. Some bombs landed as far as 3 miles from their targets, killing more French cows than German soldiers. The naval bombardment, while spectacular, also fell short of its objectives. The massive shells from the battleships were devastating against open targets, but struggled to achieve direct hits on the small, heavily reinforced concrete casemates. From miles out at sea, hitting a target the size of a small house camouflaged and dug into a cliff face was a monumental challenge. Many shells simply buried themselves in the soft earth of the bluffs, their explosive force muffled. The destroyers firing at closer range were more accurate, but their smaller 5-inch shells lacked the power to penetrate the thick reinforced concrete of the German bunkers. For the men inside the bunkers, like Heinrich Severloh, this was a grim miracle. As the deafening roar of the bombardment began to subside, replaced by the high-pitched whine of tinnitus, they slowly picked themselves up. The bunker was a mess of dust and debris, but the structure itself was sound. The concrete had held. He stumbled back to his MG-42, peering through the firing slit. The smoke was beginning to clear. His hands trembled as he rechecked the ammunition belt. Outside, the beach was a cratered, smoking landscape. The wooden stakes and many of the obstacles had been splintered and blown apart. But the core of the defense, the concrete, the machine guns, the mortars, the 80mm cannons, had survived. The unexpected outcome was a double-edged sword of psychology. For the Germans, the terror of the bombardment was now being replaced by a grim resolve. They had endured the worst the enemy could throw at them, and they were still alive, still armed. Their training kicked in. Officers and NCOs, though shaken, began to restore order, shouting commands that were barely audible over the ringing in their ears. They had been given a reprieve, a chance to fight back. For the approaching American GIs, the sight of the smoking beach created the opposite psychological effect, a surge of false hope. From their landing craft, it looked as if the plan had worked perfectly. The bluffs were on fire. The beach was obscured by smoke. They could not see the intact machine gun nests, the undestroyed mortar pits, the determined German soldiers now manning their weapons and peering out at the approaching waves of landing craft. The great naval bombardment had succeeded in shattering German communications, severing the telephone lines that connected the strong points to each other and to their artillery support. It had shattered the nerves of the defenders, inducing a state of shell shock and confusion, but it had failed in its primary mission. It had not destroyed the wall. It had merely awakened the beast. The result was the creation of a perfect storm for the landing infantry. They were heading towards an enemy they believed to be annihilated, an enemy who was in fact waiting for them, angry, terrified, and ready to unleash hell from defenses that had proven tragically resilient. The true shattering was yet to come, and it would be paid for in blood on the sands of Omaha. The psychological effect of the bombardment's failure rippled out in two opposite and colliding waves of emotion. For the German defenders, it was a rapid, jarring transition from abject terror to a desperate, fatalistic sense of duty. For the American attackers, it was a fleeting moment of optimism, a belief in a promised victory that was about to be brutally, violently dispelled. Inside WN-62 and the other surviving strongpoints along the Omaha bluffs, the moments after the naval shelling ceased were surreal. The sudden relative silence was as disorienting as the noise had been. Men looked at each other, their faces caked with dust and grime, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and adrenaline. They had survived. The concrete fortress, their tomb for the last hour, had protected them. This survival forged a strange instant bond of defiant resolve. The chain of command as a formal structure was in tatters. The field telephones were dead, their wires shredded by the shelling. Contact with the battalion headquarters inland was gone. Each Widerstands nest was now an isolated island of resistance, cut off from the world, with no orders, no intelligence, and no support. They were on their own. But in this isolation, a primitive instinct took over. The NCOs, men like Severloh, were veterans. Their training was deeply ingrained. They knew what to do. They moved through the trenches and bunkers, slapping shocked young conscripts on the shoulder, pushing them back towards their firing positions. "They're coming!" The shouts went up. "To the guns! They're coming!" Peering through the smoke, they could now clearly see them. The fleet of small landing craft, hundreds of them, churning through the waves, relentlessly heading straight for their gun sights. The sight was still terrifying in its scale, but it was no longer an abstract, inhuman force like the bombardment. This was an enemy they could see, an enemy they could fight. The fear did not vanish, but it was channeled into a focused, cold fury. Morale, which had plummeted to rock bottom, now surged with a kind of gallows humor toughness. They had been given an impossible task, to hold back the sea itself, and they were going to do it for as long as they could. They were no longer cowering victims. They were soldiers with a job to do. Aboard the LCVPs, the mood was entirely different. As they made the final run into the beach, the men of the 1st and 29th Divisions felt a surge of adrenaline-fueled confidence. They had witnessed the awesome power of the fleet, a display of force so total that it seemed inconceivable that anything could have lived through it. They could see the smoke and fires on the shore, and they believed it was the funeral pyre of the German defenses. "See, told you guys. Navy flattened them," a soldier might have yelled over the engine's roar. "We're gonna walk right on in." This misplaced optimism was a crucial psychological factor. The men were mentally prepared for a rush across a cratered beach to mop up shell-shocked survivors. They were not prepared for what was actually waiting for them. As the LCVPs ground to a halt on the sandbars and the ramps began to lower, they were standing, exposed, ready to charge into a battle they thought was already won. And in that precise moment, the two psychological waves crashed into each other with horrific force. As the first American ramps dropped, the German machine guns opened up. The sound of the MG-42, with its blistering rate of fire of over 1,200 rounds per minute, was unlike anything the green American troops had ever heard. It was not the chugging of a Browning, but a terrifying, ripping noise like canvas being torn. From dozens of intact, interlocking positions, the German gunners, who had just minutes before been cowering in terror, now unleashed a devastating storm of fire into the packed ranks of men silhouetted in the openings of their landing craft. The psychological shock for the Americans was absolute. The wave of optimism was not just halted, it was annihilated in a split second. Hope was replaced by sheer, uncomprehending horror. Men who were charging forward with a yell on their lips were cut down before they could take a single step on the sand. The water around the boats turned red. The sergeants and officers, the leaders who were supposed to guide them, were often the first to die, targeted as they stood to direct their men. The carefully laid plans, the briefings, the assurances, it all vanished in a hail of machine gun bullets and pre-sighted mortar shells that began to rain down on the beach with deadly accuracy. The men were thrown from a state of high confidence into a primal struggle for individual survival, trapped on a perfectly designed killing field, with no cover and nowhere to retreat. The shattering of German expectations by the fleet was now answered by the shattering of Allied hopes by the wall. The battle for Omaha Beach became a legend of horror and heroism, a testament to the catastrophic failure of the pre-invasion bombardment and the raw courage of the men who had to pay the price for it. The German defenses, having survived the steel typhoon, performed exactly as designed. For hours, they pinned the American soldiers on the tidal flats, inflicting devastating casualties and bringing the entire invasion of that sector to the brink of collapse. From his position in WN-62, Heinrich Severloh would later claim to have fired over 12,000 rounds from his MG-42 and hundreds more with his rifle. He and the handful of men with him became an anchor of the German defense, their interlocking fire sweeping the easy red sector of the beach, cutting down wave after wave of American infantry. They fought with the desperate energy of men who knew they were doomed but were determined to sell their lives dearly. For them, the battle was no longer about winning the war. It was about survival and exacting the highest possible cost from the invaders. But the very thing that had shattered their morale at dawn was the same thing that ultimately guaranteed their defeat. The unstoppable, overwhelming scale of the Allied invasion. While individual bunkers and strongpoints could hold out, they could not hold out forever. The fleet was more than just a bombardment platform. It was a conveyor belt of men and steel. Behind the savaged first wave came a second and a third. Destroyers, seeing the disaster unfolding on the beach, defied orders and steamed dangerously close to the shore, blasting the German bunkers with direct, point-blank fire, slowly, painstakingly. Through acts of individual bravery and small unit leadership, the Americans began to gain a foothold. Pockets of men, led by surviving NCOs and officers like Captain Dawson, found shelter under the lip of the shingle or at the base of the bluffs. They bypassed the main killing zones and began to find ravines and gullies leading up the cliffs. With Bangalore torpedoes to blow holes in the barbed wire, and with covering fire from the few tanks that made it ashore, they started to climb. The battle for Omaha became a vertical fight. Small groups of American infantry, armed with rifles, grenades, and flamethrowers, began to assault the German strongpoints from the sides and the rear. The isolated German nests, designed to fight an enemy on the beach in front of them, were now being attacked from all directions. Their communications were gone. Their ammunition was running low. Their commanders were dead or wounded. The German defense, so strong and cohesive at 0630, began to unravel bunker by bunker. By midday, the crisis had passed. The Americans had clawed their way to the top of the bluffs and were beginning to push inland. The Atlantic Wall on Omaha Beach had been breached, not by the bombs or the shells, but by the sheer bloody-minded determination of the infantry. The cost was staggering. Over 2,400 American casualties lay on that 4-mile stretch of sand, making it the deadliest of all the D-Day beaches. The broader impact was profound. The struggle on Omaha demonstrated the immense difficulty of amphibious assaults against a prepared and determined enemy. It was a brutal lesson that would be remembered in future operations in the Pacific. For the Germans, the fall of the Normandy defenses marked the beginning of the end. Despite the tactical success of the defense on Omaha, the strategic failure was total. The Allies were ashore, and with their complete air and sea superiority, they could pour men and material into the beachhead faster than the Germans could ever hope to contain them. The wall, Rommel's great shield, had been broken in less than a day. In the late afternoon, with his position about to be overrun, Heinrich Severlo was wounded and forced to retreat. He left behind a smoking machine gun and a beach littered with the dead. The great concrete casemate of WN-62, which had seemed like the strongest place on Earth that morning, was now just a silent, scarred monument to a failed defense. The image that would forever be seared into his memory was not the carnage he inflicted, but the sight that had greeted him at dawn. The endless forest of ships. It was the physical manifestation of an industrial and military might that his country could no longer match. The defenses had not been shattered by a single shell, but by the crushing, inevitable weight of that entire fleet and the world it represented. It was a force that had bent steel, pulverized concrete, and ultimately broken the will of a continent. The longest day was over, and the road to the heart of the Reich was now open.